Hey team, welcome back to another episode of the Strength Game Podcast. I'm your host, Nick O'Brien, and this is episode number 64. The Strength Game is a weekly podcast dedicated to discussing all things physical culture with the coaches, athletes, iron enthusiasts, and experts deeply embedded in the strength game on both sides of the profession, both as coaches and as competitive athletes. I want to thank everyone who has subscribed to the show, everyone who has left us a great review. Anyone else who has liked, shared, or commented. Your support allows us to continue to bring on expert guests and highlight more individuals in the strength game, just like our guests today. Also want to thank our sponsors. Samson Equipment provides first-class weight rooms and has earned an excellent reputation of providing the finest quality design and customer service. Being a direct manufacturer, the team at Samson brings full customization capabilities in not only branding, but in custom equipment needed to execute your project. From racks, barbells, and plates to dumbbells, benches, flooring, storage, and more, Samson equipment is durable and made to order from premium grade materials, all built from scratch, start to finish. Samson equipment provides professional weight room solutions for all your strength and conditioning needs. See the Samson standard for yourself and learn more at samsonequipment.com. Also want to thank our sponsor, Cerberus Strength. If you're in the market for the highest quality strength and conditioning gear and equipment, be sure to use promo code strength_game at checkout to receive 10% off your next order at cerberusstrength.com. And this week's episode, I am joined by Andrew Wentz. Andrew is an assistant strength conditioning coach at High Point University, where he oversees the training for the men's lacrosse, volleyball, and women's soccer teams. He arrived at High Point in late 2021 by way of nearby Wake Forest University, where he was an intern coach. Wentz began his coaching career, personal training in 2016, and served in similar internship positions at both UNC Greensboro and Southern University while personal training. He is a powerlifting coach and has been working with clients in person as well as online for the past 2 years. Wentz is a former collegiate hammer thrower for Eastern Michigan's University track and field program. He competed in both indoor and outdoor with personal bests of an 18.18 meters in the weight throw and 54.43 meters in the hammer throw. Since his college throwing career, he continues to train heavily in various different methods, as well as stepping onto the platform to compete in powerlifting. I'm excited to have him on the show today. So with all that said, let's get in the game with Coach Andrew Wentz. What's going on, everybody? I'm excited today. I am joined by what was a former conference foe. Both of us joined in pretty much the same time, High Point versus Jacksonville. Now we're kind of separated, but luckily we got to meet up a little bit over the conference tournament and actually chat in person. So I've got Coach Andrew Wentz on the show. How's it going, man?
Hey, it's going good. I'm real happy to be here. Thank you.
No, I'm excited. We didn't get to meet the first time we were around. And then luckily I got to go into your territory, and luckily I appreciate you showing me around the facility and the weight room and everything. Next time we'll have to get a lift in together, but no, I'm excited to have you on. I'm glad that it's summer and we can actually wind down a bit.
Yeah, it'll be nice.
Yeah, I know, especially for you, since you kind of hopped right in immediately on the fall and got thrown to the wolves right away. We're going to kind of do the same thing right now. So I really want to learn how you got involved in the strength game, what sports you kind of played growing up, leading into what you currently do for your own training.
Yeah, so I've played sports since I was very, very little. I played soccer and t-ball. I hated t-ball, so I never continued with that. But I played soccer and t-ball, and then at some point moved into football, and then moved out of football and played water polo. And my older sisters were swimmers, so when I got into high school, I swam. And somewhere in all that, I got on the track team and thought I was going to be a sprinter, and turns out I was just a fat kid that couldn't run. So they turned me into a thrower, which then led me to college, where I was a hammer thrower for Eastern Michigan, which was a lot of fun. And I highly encourage anyone who wants to be on a track team, do it. Hammer is so much fun. But so that's I've always been around athletics. I've always been moving and doing something. And then when I went off to college, I knew if I didn't do something, I would just sit around and just get fat. And I didn't want to do that. That's not the life I wanted to lead. So I talked to the track coach at Eastern. I'd already committed to being a student there for their aviation program originally. I wanted to fly planes. And my throws coach looked at me and said, I can guarantee you have a chance. And that's what he offered me, is he would give me a shot at making roster. And so those first, I don't know, 2, 3, 4 months of college were just, you are not on this team yet. You have to earn your place. Go. And I did everything. And I will freely admit, I am extraordinarily average as an athlete. I'm not going to make any record books anywhere. I'm never going to be the strongest, the fastest, the best at anything. But I will work as hard as I can to at the very least be good enough to be worthwhile. And so after a couple months, I can remember this day very vividly. We were inside because it was thunderstorming, and my coach had been trying to get me to learn a concept and learn a concept and learn a concept, and I just couldn't get it. And then just one day it was storming, we're inside, and I finally clicked in my head. And I don't know how or why, but it did. And my coach was so excited. He went over to the head coach, and the head coach walked over to me and said, well, Mans just said you earned your spot on the roster, so congratulations, and walked off. And that's how that went. And then, so from that point on, I'm like, okay, now I know what this goes. I have to always work. And so again, extraordinarily average. My hammer throwing career was fine. I know what I was. I was there to score 1, maybe 2 points, which is exactly what I did. But that is what got me into training for real. So like, we didn't really lift in high school. It was just, I'm in the water, I'm out throwing. Like, that's how my year went. For swimming, we would do dry land, but it was a lot of like med ball throws, do this conditioning, do these jumping jacks, do that. Occasionally we would lift a little something here or there. Track, we would lift a little something here or there. But then it wasn't until college that we started lifting. And so, like I said, I went up there to be an aviation major. I wanted to fly planes, but that was ungodly expensive. It more or less doubled your semester tuition, and I could not afford that. So that quickly became not a thing. I thought I was going to be a pre-med major, and so I did. I was a bio and chem major my sophomore year, and I am not good at bio or chem. That just was beyond me. And so I didn't know what I was going to do. And throughout this whole time, I'm still throwing, I'm still training, I'm still lifting. And I finally went from this like chubby nothing kid to like, oh, I have muscle and I carry myself a little better now. And I feel more confident in myself, and I'm doing better with friends and with track and with school because I feel better about myself. And it slowly became that when I wasn't doing homework and I had nothing else to do, I'm looking up T Nation and Elite FTS. I'm like, okay, why are we doing what we're doing in the weight room, and why is it benefiting me throwing? And so it got to the point that I was just nonstop looking at things like that and following different coaches and different bodybuilders and things like that. And finally, sometime during sophomore year, I'm like, this is what I want to do. Is I want to get into exercise physiology. And I didn't quite know yet that I wanted to be a strength coach. At that point, I was thinking about maybe being a throws coach. And I kind of toyed with that, and I started paying a little more attention to my coach and spending a little bit more time there, and ultimately realized that I really only care about hammer. That to me is the most fun. There's nothing wrong with the other 3 throws events. That's just not what I care about. So that, of course, was not going to be an option for me. So I'm like, well, I still really want to be involved in athletics, and I really want to do something with physiology. And it just one day in the weight room, I was watching one of the cross country dudes do leg curls, and they're so lean that I can see the muscle fibers contracting. I'm like, that's the coolest thing I've ever seen in my life. And that's what it was, is I'm like, okay, how do I make that bigger? How do I make it stronger? Why does that work the way it does? And that was the day that I'm like, I want to be a strength coach. And I'm a sophomore or junior in college, so I'm already far enough into academics that it's going to be a sprint to the end. But I did get my degree done, and I never once have looked back on that. This is absolutely what I want to do until I die, when I will die on coaching on the floor.
I like it. I think you might be the first person that goes aviation to strength and conditioning. So wild turn of events.
It was a wild turn of events. My parents were really surprised. They weren't really surprised that we couldn't afford it. They knew for a long time. They just didn't want to break my heart on it, which I appreciate, because I think that was helpful in letting me come to my own terms with it. But they were very surprised when I went exercise physiology. They really thought I would stay pre-med or do something with kids, because I do love kids. But that's just not the route I wanted to go.
I gotcha. I think it's like finding your career like that is always interesting, and figuring out how people get into not just like the strength conditioning profession, but like the coaching profession in general too.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of reminiscent of how you got your, like, basically got on the team as a thrower, where yeah, it feels like there's that tipping point where something just clicked, and it's really just a noticeable point where you really shifted focus. And for you, that was like, hey, this throw actually clicked. I got the technique. And I think it's the same way with coaching, like that one moment when like you realize like, oh, that athlete's doing that. Like, how can I improve it? But it really was a lot of small events, like you like doing all that research on your own, and kind of going through all the muscle mags and like all the different forums online and things like that. That was like slowly shifting your focus until finally that one big thing kind of tipped it over, which is cool to kind of reminisce upon and understand, like, all right, I could do this for a living now, which is cool too.
Right.
Hey, so kind of touching on like how you got into the profession, because obviously nowadays people go into school, a lot of them, and they're like, I know I want to do coaching, or I know I want to do X Phys. You kind of played around with a few different careers. Luckily, you got to graduate with your bachelor's like in X Phys, so you knew along those lines. But some like relatively recently, you're still kind of a little bit behind the eight ball in terms of like college level like coaching. So how were you able to like really kind of put a lot more experience under your belt? Because I know you did personal training, you did a bunch of internships to get to your role now. How are you like organizing that and like really trying to soak in as much coaching as you could in a quick amount of time?
So I guess let's start chronologically. I knew I wanted to get into this, like I said, when I was like a sophomore and junior. I studied the curriculum. I did what I had to do. My advisors were like, okay, you need an internship. And if that's what you want to do, you got to find an internship in that. So I found an internship at a local high school, because I went to Eastern Michigan up in Ypsilanti. So I found a high school in Ann Arbor. And Coach Bettinger, Coach B, love the man to death still to this day. He had me come in and was like, fine, you can intern here, and that's fine. And so from that point, it was always watching him and how did he carry himself, and what did he do, and how did he make decisions. And it wasn't so much about coaching anyone at that point. It was, who do I need to be a good coach? And so I spent a lot of time there, and I'm now good friends with him, and two of the other interns there were still good friends. But then I always knew I needed a master's. Like, you cannot get into this profession without it at this point. So then I knew I needed a master's, so I took a year off. I started personal training. I worked for an LA Fitness, which gave me money. It gave me coaching time. It forced me to start making some of those decisions and figuring myself out to see who I am as a coach. And I went to LSU for a master's, and transferred down to an LA Fitness down there to pay bills while I'm doing it. And then while I'm down there, I'm of course studying that curriculum, but I fell into a group of powerlifters down there. And I think for me, that was probably one of the biggest things I could do for myself. So one of my classmates was like, hey, you should come train with us. This is what we do. We do multiply powerlifting. I'm like, that sounds awful. I'm in. And so I started training at this gym, and honestly, I think I learned more from him and from training with him than I did from the entirety of my master's, because he knew so much, because he'd been doing this for a lot longer, and he knew from a young age that's what he wanted to do, and he had run D3 college out in California, and so he had so much background and information and structure on himself that every day it's like, okay, well, why did we do this? Why did you do that? Why did we make this decision? And I always had to justify it. And the man's so much smarter than me. I had to come out guns hot. I had to have a good answer immediately, or he would just roast me into oblivion. And then, of course, there's also the training aspect of like, that's where I learned conjugate, like basically true West Side conjugate. Because this man himself, I expect will get an invitation to train at West Side at some point in his life. We had another training partner who had been at West Side with Louis for a number of years. And so I got to learn their system and how that works. And it was beneficial to understand that system because I use so much of it now. A lot of people get conjugate wrong, and that's just because everyone wants to think that bands and chains is conjugate, and it's not. But we can go into that later. But so that was really helpful in me understanding, especially while I'm getting my master's, understanding the physiology and understanding why things work the way they do. And so that was really helpful for me. And then, so I got an internship at Southern University there in Baton Rouge, and worked for a few weeks there under Ty Webb, who's now at, I get it wrong every time. I always want to say Purdue, and I believe he's at Notre Dame. If not, it's the other. I always get that one wrong. And he was big on the Olympic list, which I hadn't done since I graduated. And he was like, you're going to coach it this way because this is the correct way. This is the Hatch way. You do it this way. And so I learned a lot from him. And then he left to be under Osmus at USC, and continued working with Laramie Immel, who's still there at Southern. And Laramie was just a few years older than me, but he was still a little bit further than me. So he did a lot of some of the smaller things. Like up until that point, I'd never thought about hamstrings from a hip standpoint versus a knee standpoint. We train hamstrings. We're fine. Why does it matter? It does matter. And I had never thought about it. So I learned a lot of the smaller details from him because he is very detail oriented, and he always makes sure that there is something rotational and something lateral and something in this plane and that plane and this. He is phenomenal at things like that. And I wouldn't be nearly as good as I am without him and how he processes things. And then from there, I hated Baton Rouge. I wanted to get out. I wanted to leave Louisiana so bad. Yeah. I've come to terms with the fact that there is a price for me to go back, but it is a high price. I do not ever want to go back if I don't have to. I didn't like it. And that's nothing on the people there. It's just, that's not a state I want to live in. So I left to be up here in Greensboro with my now wife and started working under Danny Wheel at UNC Greensboro. And one of the assistants there, RJ Gabeau, who's now at Mercer, he is very science-based. So everything has to be in a textbook. Everything has to be peer reviewed and cited. And so he runs an APRE derivative that I picked up from him, and that helped me process my organizational structure. So now I've got the Olympics, I've got the speed and the max effort work, and now I have an organizational structure that I've learned from Coach Gabeau. And all of those things combined were necessary for me to be even remotely good enough to start, or remotely good enough to have a job. If I would have missed out on any of those people, I would not have gotten this job. I wouldn't be where I needed to be a full-time paid coach. And then after the pandemic, I just needed a place to call home. So the coaches at Wake Forest took me in until High Point opened up a position, and it was close to home, which is where Steph and I wanted to be here. So we were very fortunate in that. But all of those coaches, without them, I wouldn't be nearly good enough to be here now.
No, it's awesome to kind of hear like your trajectory and everything. And obviously, like learning in the very beginning, you're taking information in through a fire hose, and on top of a master's degree where you're kind of reading all the research and brushing up on all the stuff that makes it accredited, you're like also going to places to train and learn from other people that are pretty much all under the bar experience. Like those guys know everything it is. They just don't have a piece of paper to say that they know it. And
correct.
I mean, we all know that when you go to a place like that, those are some of the most knowledgeable people you're ever going to meet in the profession. And peer reviews aside, you can't take away what they're doing on the platform.
Absolutely. Experience matters every bit as much as education. And I know a lot of people will disagree. Like, if you don't have the education, you don't have the peer review, then it doesn't matter. It absolutely does. If you've never been strong, you don't know how to make someone strong. Like, that's just the way it is. Now, having that peer review just solidifies that you're doing things the best way, or a better way. How about that? Maybe not the best way, but experience absolutely matters.
Yeah. And I think it's a testament to like everything that you had to do and what most people in the profession have to do, where you have to collect those internships and you have to go through. And honestly, like, we know at this point in time, like a master's degree is like the base minimum to even get an internship at this point. Right. So it's kind of wild standards to have, but I think it's a way to kind of hold people to a line that you need to be just as educated, but you also have to have experience. And that's why it is kind of an apprenticeship style profession, just like whatever, like tattooing and like blacksmithing or whatever it is, like that you actually have to pay your dues. You have to learn from someone and be smart, kind of like what you did when you were interning, like back at Eastern at that high school. Like, you weren't observing what the program was, you were observing what the coach was doing. Like, you were observing what someone in the role you want to be in is actually doing, because the X's and O's are interchangeable. Just like you went to multiple different places and you learn different systems from the person in charge. Like, you can learn the system from a book and read it, but it's different when you actually go and you learn it from someone that is implementing it specifically, which I think is more important for coaching. I think that, like, you go out and you try this stuff yourself, try it on your athletes. Yes, then you can go probably talk to the expert and figure out exactly where they're going by. Right. But it's all context, it's all situation based. So you need to have a grasp of, does it apply to you specifically? And with more tools and more experience under your belt, you're able to do what you're doing now, like in your first full-time role, and put that together and create your own system. So, like, if you were kind of to go back, if there was any advice for someone like getting into their transitioning or trying to get into their first full-time position, what advice would you have from them, either based off your experience or maybe something that you wish you would have known a little bit more before you would have started your first full-time job at High Point?
I think the best advice, I think the two biggest pieces of advice that I've ever received that I always like to pass along, my strength and conditioning professor in undergrad, who would say every week, there's no rules in strength and conditioning. You do whatever you want to do, and it's going to work for almost anybody. You just have to then make sure it's right for that person. But there are no rules in strength and conditioning. You can make any system work for any athlete, and it may not be the best, but it'll work. And that's where some of the coaching philosophies come in of, I can make an APRE system work because I believe in it, and I can make you believe in it, and I can make you buy into it. And that's one of the part of the coaching philosophies of, can I get that buy-in? But if you can't get that buy-in, if you don't believe in that system, then it's not going to work. And it doesn't matter. Go to another system. There are no rules. You can do whatever you want. You can make anything work. You don't have to run an Olympics base. You don't have to run a powerlifting base. Find something that you know works and use it. And then the other major piece of advice was from Coach B at Skyline. Don't ever confuse movement with progress. Make sure that whatever you're doing has a purpose. Make sure that purpose is towards the goal that you want for them. I remember why he was screaming at them that day. They had all gone into the gym one day and maxed out their bench right before a big test day or something. And he's like, what do you get? And then they came in tired, and they were whining about some things, and they just like weren't putting out effort because they were tired from the day before, because they maxed out on their own instead of doing what they were supposed to do. And he was hot because they just would not do what we needed them to do. And so he had them pushing carpet sleds on the basketball floor. And he keeps screaming about, don't confuse movement with progress. You moved yesterday, but that's not progress. We're not in a max out phase. And I think those two things have always carried through, of like, do whatever you want as long as it makes sense to you, but also make sure it has a purpose. And those are the two biggest things that have always been really important for me. And then I think the last big thing that took me a long time to come to is be creative, right? Like, you don't, just because you haven't seen it on Instagram doesn't mean it's not useful, right? If you're doing the same mobility work, and for me, it's mobility is where I tend to do most of my creative process. You have to see the movement, see what you're doing, and then how can we progress it? How can we make this better? How can we regress it? If someone can't do this, how do we make that accessible to them? Which, like I said, for me, I do a lot of that with mobility, because mobility is, of course, not anyone's favorite thing. Nobody just loves mobility. So I always have to be creative, and how can I put this in without them realizing that's what it is? How can I make this easier for this athlete who has this injury and can't move that way? And things like that. Or another big one is, how can I make them more resilient? So the big thing I think this year for me, outside of mobility work, was I started doing manual heel lifts on split squats and hip thrusts. So far are the only two major things that I do. And I don't know if it worked. I don't know if it's going to work, but my athletes tell me that they feel better on it. So to me, that's good enough. But I wouldn't have ever thought to do that if I hadn't seen Cal Dietz say something about, I started training the foot this way and that way. And I'm not smart enough to understand what he's talking about. So I just took it and thought about it and did the best I could. But I wouldn't have ever done that if not for seeing him and thinking about it and trying to be creative and how do I implement this?
No, those are some great points. And I'm sure that those points, and along with all the other people and like all the other stops you've had along your way, have kind of shaped and morphed your own philosophy a little bit more each in time. But no, those are great pieces of advice, especially for people that are probably going to pick up different things from different stops along the way.
Exactly.
But if you keep those kind of main things together, I think that's a great way to do it. And obviously, like, being able to coach within yourself and be creative with that too, that's going to be super helpful. And I mean, that's probably exactly what your program looks like. It's taking the things that you do like, the things that you feel confident with from all your stops and experience, or what you personally think is going to benefit your athletes, even if it might not. Essentially, you can kind of test it out. But you're the one that's basically got to be confident in it. And right, if the athletes are going to be bought into it, that's even more helpful. Right. That's great. Hey, so you yourself, you trained throwing, you did some team sports when you were first growing up, but like from college going on, like into powerlifting and everything, you did a lot of individual sports. I know you trained with a powerlifting group and everything, and that's a great dynamic. And the same with like being on a track and field team, like that's a great dynamic to have throwers and coaches give you feedback. But at the end of the day, like when you step in the ring, you step on the platform, you're by yourself. Correct. And that's a completely different element that a lot of team sport athletes growing up just never really get to experience. Like from that experience, like, have you been able to use any of those, like either mental cues or like approach or goal setting or anything along those lines, to help your team sport athletes kind of work better as individuals to benefit their training?
Yes. I'll start with myself. With being an individual athlete and not on a team sport, the big thing for me was always self-ownership, right? I can't make excuses because I don't have anybody else to back me up. If I don't throw well that day, I don't have somebody else who can pick up the slack. Like, I didn't throw well. I can't take 2 feet off my teammate's throw and put it onto mine and call it a PR, right? So I always had to take ownership. If I messed up, it's on me. And so that was really helpful coming into programming for athletes as a whole, of like, I am now responsible for this. If I mess up, they mess up, and that's not their fault. I have to take ownership for that. And then, so going down to coaching them, I implemented, I don't like to say punishment, but for punishment, one person messes up, they have to take ownership. We'll use rack standard. Like, we have to put the plates back in a certain way. The bars all go a certain way. One person messes up, they have to take ownership of that. And I expect them to do that. But then it's also the team now has to deal with that within themselves. So that's just one small example of that. But also, I put it on them as individuals of like, you yourself have to take ownership of your training. And if you're not doing the stick work, the skill work, you're not doing the lift, you're not pushing yourself, right? That's on you, but it impacts the team. You have to take ownership of that. And now, fortunately for them, if they don't, there's usually somebody who can pick up that slack for them. But I try, and I know the coaching staff here tries to very much put it on, you yourself have to do everything you can, take your own ownership, and it'll benefit the team. And you see that a lot in individual sports, and especially like powerlifting. Yes, there was a group. So in multiply, I had to get into a squat suit. I had to use a shirt bench, or I use a shirt for benching. I needed people to get me into it. I needed people to tighten things down. I could not physically do it by myself. But you're right. When I got on that platform, I had to do the thing. And so that concept is what I try to use with athletes. Of, you have these people, they are going to help you, but if you mess up, it's on you. And just like if you do well, that's on you. You did great. Give credit where credit is due. You got the assist. Your teammate did this, but you finished it. Take ownership of that as well. You did great. Good job. So I think that's probably the biggest takeaways from individual sports into team sports, I think, at least from my end.
No, I like that. I like how you put it too, because when you do get to go out and throw, or you're powerlifting, like, there is a team behind that individual. There's a team behind it, but at the end of the day, the individual has to perform. And like you said, you have to take some self-ownership of it and accountability. Mm-hmm. At that point, you can't place the blame on anybody else. They're not out there to perform. Like, their job is to make sure to get you ready so that you have all the intangibles, you have the preparation is done. You actually have to go out and execute. And I think that's a great way to like frame it too for even team sport athletes, because like, obviously, like even lacrosse or soccer or volleyball, there's only one person that has the ball at a time. Like, you're working for the same goal. Like, you're working off ball, you're doing different things at different times, but really only one person is like on the quote unquote platform or in the ring at the time that's actually doing the majority of the performing. So what you do as like the team behind the team, like, that stuff is going to impact if they can perform or not. And I think that's great if you can get everybody on the team to take some ownership individually of themselves, just kind of like you do with like the discipline piece, and like holding them accountable to the standards of like how the rack is set up, like how they have to break things down, whatever you end up choosing it to be. Like, if they can take ownership of themselves, then at the end of the day, the sum of all the parts is greater than the whole. So you can be a better team if everybody individually is improving. And that's always been my thought process too, especially like transitioning into more like individual sports myself. Like, I've always not liked the fact of someone not pulling their weight, but that's what happens on a team. So
yes, there's always somebody who doesn't.
Exactly. So if you can at least hold yourself accountable to it, and you're not willing to place the blame even on a team sport, then everybody will start to drive it up. And if the standard raises, then you'll lose some of those losers, which is the best part about it.
Yeah, exactly.
Hey, so nowadays, like, how do you kind of approach your own training, and why, like, do you feel like it's still important, even if you're not getting on the platform or you're not going to throw like in a competition? Why do you still feel it's viable and like important for you to still kind of continue to train as well?
So I've seen arguments from some strength coaches that if you take time to train, that you are not doing enough as a coach. And I've never really liked that, because I've always felt like you as a strength coach, need to be pushing yourself. I'm asking this athlete to get under 400 pounds and squat it, but yet I'm not willing to get under my 95% and squat it. Like, no, that's ridiculous. If I'm asking you to do this, I need to be doing this in some capacity. Now, if you've got somebody who can squat 700 pounds and you can only squat 350, like, okay, you obviously can't get under 650. But the relative expression there, if I'm going to ask you to work this hard, I also need to work this hard. And so that's to me always the biggest thing. And then a very close second is, if I'm going to try to run a system, I need to know what it feels like. I've never ran 5-3-1. I don't know what it feels like. I'm not going to run 5-3-1 for my athletes. I run a conjugate APRE derivative for my athletes. So I myself run a conjugate APRE derivative. I know what it feels like. I know what I'm asking of my athletes. I know what demand I'm putting on their body. I know what stress load I'm putting on their bodies. And because of that, I also know how it feels when you unload, because that's what I'm doing. I need to know exactly how everything's going to go before I ask it of them. So that's why I think we should be training. And at some point, I know you're going to have to transition out of that. Like, at some point, I'm going to get too old that I can't train this way. Okay, fine, but I've done it, and I know I can do it, and I still know what it feels like. But I've never agreed that you need to spend all your time trying to be a better coach, because at some point you also have to be a better athlete, even if you don't want to compete. Because I'm not really that competitive anymore. I have really settled into the old man coaching lifestyle of, I'm going to train, but I don't want to compete again. It's fine.
Yeah, that's that comes and goes for people, definitely. But no, I think as a coach, striving to be a better athlete, and you can define athlete however you want. That's the difference. And I think that's where some people get lost in semantics when they say those things. But no, I couldn't disagree with them saying that as a coach, if you have time to train, you're not coaching hard enough. That's asinine to like think that, and to think that basically now, hey, okay, like I'm a conductor for a train. Like, I can't do anything else but be on that train for 24 hours a day and drive it around the world. That's the dumbest thing I've heard. And I get it. I get the fact that as a coach, your number one priority is to coach. But if your hobby, if like your sleep quality, if your nutrition, if all those things that you do makes you a better coach, why wouldn't you want that to be done and to have a better product for your athletes so that you can coach better? And I think we should be, as coaches, like a living model. And obviously, same as you said, like, if you can't squat 700, you don't need to replicate what these athletes are doing. That's why they're in the position they are. We're coaching because most of us weren't probably the best athletes anyway.
Right.
So relatively speaking, you still need to challenge yourself and be the best at whatever your project or your program is going to be. And if it's conjugate APRE derivative is what your system is, and that's how you're training, then just train that to the best of your abilities. And athletes don't care as long as you're putting the same effort and you're practicing what you preach, I think.
Right. You'll get a lot more respect, in my opinion, and in my experience, which, granted, I haven't been coaching for 20 years yet. Maybe that'll change. But in my experience, like, my athletes respect me a lot more because they know I'm still working. Every once in a while, they'll come in at the end of my lift and they'll catch something. And I know I get a lot for that, because they know I'm not just saying it to say it. I'm not telling them that they need to recover, but I'm not recovering. I'm doing my mobility work. I'm doing my everything I can to recover as well, because I'm asking that of them. And I think they do a lot more for me because they know I am also doing that for them.
Yeah. And I think that makes the ask a little bit less like ridiculous or however you want to word it, because of the fact that you're doing it yourself and you're not asking them to do something that you're not willing to do or you haven't done. But I think that it's a testament to, like, training and doing all the internships and everything in the front end when you're young in your career and you have a lot of piss and vinegar and you're excited about the profession, yeah, you're probably going to train a lot different in 2 decades in this
Yes.
profession. So
Yes.
if you really want to get the most out of it and really kind of for a little bit in the beginning, like burn the candle at both ends, then fuck, by all means do that in the very beginning. But
Right.
it's definitely going to change later on. And
Yes.
I don't foresee myself competing in like 10 more years, maybe. Who knows? But put your coals to the fire a little bit, see what it feels like to do what they're doing and test out your programs. And gain a little bit of respect with your athletes. I think that goes a long way, even if they're just peeking in and they see you like hobbling over like that.
Yep.
That pays its way in gold for sure.
Yes.
Hey, so with kind of like your coaching experience, obviously you've got to get it from a bunch of different people. Kind of flip the question for it, because you've learned a lot of stuff from your training and trying programs that you actually directly implement with your athletes that you tweak to make sure it fits for their sport and everything. But from a different perspective and your coaching, how does that kind of help with your training? Like, are there any cues? Are there any things that like your athletes or like maybe a specific moment that have really taught you that you've been able to take back and perfect and kind of fix your craft in your own training?
Actually, yeah. And I've got a major example for you. I hate Olympic lifting for myself. I hate doing it. It doesn't feel good. I don't like it. I like to use it for my athletes. And so when I got here, they're just, because of Ty Webb, who had a very specific way of coaching it and a very high standard on how to coach Olympics and what it should look like, I have a high standard of what it should look like. And when I came in, there were just a couple minor things that I needed to tweak. And so I started implementing low pulls and high pulls. And so you'll do 2 low pulls, a high pull, and then you'll clean. Or you'll do 3 low pulls and no high pulls and a clean. And I started mixing it up like that throughout and from different positions and doing things like that. And just watching how quickly they benefited from that, I started doing that myself for my Olympic lifts, which again, I hate doing, but I know I should. I have a standard for myself of like, I want to be able to clean 225 and snatch 135. As long as I can do that, I don't care. I'm never going to snatch 180. Again, I don't need to, I don't want to. But as long as I can snatch 135, I'm happy. As long as I can clean 225, I'm happy. I can demonstrate well enough with basically anything they're going to put up for the most part. But just implementing those low pulls and high pulls in various combinations, I saw a lot of really good technique shifts from most of them. And so I started implementing that with myself, and my technique got immensely better. That I never thought I would be better than what I was while I was at Southern, which was atrocious. It was not good, but I never expected that I could get better because I've been doing it so long. And then just this small fix that I made for them really helped me out. And then some of the stretching and mobility, I wasn't getting enough effort with putting stretching at the end of lift, like most, or like a lot of coaches tend to do. So I started breaking it up, and I'll put a stretch somewhere in the beginning third, somewhere in the middle third, and then somewhere at the end, or just 1 or 2 of those depending on the day. And I saw a lot more effort than if I just do a bunch of stretching at the end. And so I started doing that again with myself, and I am more consistent with it because it's now just in my lift instead of at the end when I'm tired and I don't want to do anymore. So those are 2 really big things that just coaching then impacted me as a lifter. It was surprising to me to see that. When I got into this, I just assumed that my training would impact them, but I never considered that training them would impact me.
No, that's great. I think those simple changes or things that you're able to take away from coaching and training and kind of go back and forth. That's why I think it's such an important aspect of being a coach, because I mean, staff lifts, going to see other people in their place, or even like you watching other coaches on your staff like train or train with or bounce ideas off of. Like all the stuff that we're doing a lot of times is trial and error.
Right.
Like besides like even like peer reviewed stuff like we talked about where someone's really into the weeds with that, like they're still in a very controlled environment, and everything about college athletics and athletics in general is the complete opposite of that. So to say that you have to do training based off peer reviewed research is like, great, go fucking do peer reviewed research, go do more of
Right.
it. But
Right.
you're working with athletes, so whatever the results end up being, like it's in the confinements of an athletic schedule. Like you're working with them and they're not trying to get better at that, whatever the whole research study is about. They're trying to get better at their sport. So
Right.
no, I think that's great. But yeah, the coach, like having a coaching eye, having to find ways to pick up coaching cues and just build it on reps and reps and reps. I think that the same as training helps you coach better. The amount of reps that you see from an athlete, the amount of reps you see with different shaped athletes with different experience levels, all the things that you're going to get on like bigger rosters or just with more time. Those are subtle things that, like, same as we talked about before, just kind of click and then help your own training. And I think it's just a revolving door where one feeds into the other, one feeds in the other. So no, those are great things. Like speaking on that too, like how has it been transitioning to like your first full-time staff and working within a department? Because it's a little bit different when you're an intern and you're kind of like, hey, it's either a curriculum or you're kind of going through some of the basic stuff in the beginning, or you're like, hey, you need to learn my system. Now it's more so, hey, what is your system? This is what I do. Like, how can we help each other? Like, and you can now bounce more ideas off of. How has that transition been like for your coaching and training benefit?
So I'll say this: I've never been shy of asking, "What are you doing, and why are you doing it?" I've been asking that of coaches since I started doing this. So that to me wasn't really a big change. It's what I've been doing from the start. I think the big thing for me was exactly like you said, seeing other coaches and how they're training, both their athletes and themselves, and discussing then different ideas about why they're doing that. I do a lot. I walk around barefoot all the time. I come to work and I take my shoes off. And so my head Terrence here, he asked me why, and I said, well, I saw this article a couple of years ago about the spreading of your feet, and since I've started doing it, I've had way less knee and hip problems. And so he started doing it, and now because of that, we start talking about different ways. And so that was another thought process in coming to the manual heel lift on split squats and hip thrusts, is because Terrence and I were discussing it and how it could potentially benefit. And I don't know that I would have come to it on my own without that conversation. I know one of the other assistants here is way better at speed and sprints and agility than I am. And so just talking to him about things like that, I've gotten better about how to implement, like for volleyball, some sprint work and trying to get that power development there. And now that I've started doing that, I really like that. But I don't know that I would have come to that without having that conversation with John. So it's things like that. And then for me, like I said, I've settled into my old man training. So my changes are going to be slow and tortoise-like. So like, I'm not ready to get back into sprinting or running in general, because the last handful of times I've done it, it just really didn't feel good, which means I didn't implement it well. But I'm just not mentally ready to get back into that, even though I would kind of like to. I just know I'm not mentally ready. Going off of being within a staff, I think the biggest change from being an intern to a staff member is the communication that it takes to actually run a department. Like there's always like, hey, this athlete wants to come in at this because of a class change. Like, does anyone have a conflict? Or like, this team wants to change because of X, Y, and Z. Can we do that? And scheduling and working around class times that I never had to deal with. I just, as an intern, you're here from 6 a.m. to noon or whatever you could do, and you're just there. And now it's okay, well, I have a team here, I have a team there, I need to get my workout, and I need to go run an errand real quick. Do I have time to do that? So the actual logistical running of a department was a massive change that I don't know that there's any way to be prepared for until you just have to do it, and you just have to suck it up and go.
Yeah, I'd probably agree. I think being an intern, you feel like there's so much stuff that you don't know, and there's so many questions you don't know where to start, that you feel like, yeah, you're just there. You're kind of just existing, and you might get 10 questions in for the day, but you still have a book full of how do I do this? So yeah, you can be as prepared as you want to for a position, like whatever it is, even if you're elevated from a staff member to like an assistant director position or a director role or AD role, it doesn't matter. Like, you're not going to feel the full weight of what those roles and responsibilities are until you're sitting in that chair. So
Exactly.
it's definitely different. But no, I think that's one of the best parts about being on a staff and being able to just sit there and open a conversation, open a dialogue, and really just get lost in a rabbit hole with someone. And it's nice when there's people on staff that have a different knowledge base, a different background, or even just like a favorite niche or something that's unique to them, because that just makes you a more well-rounded coach. And I mean, that's what we've been trying to do with our staff more so. Is I know that staff members are better at something than me. Why would I coach my athletes and give them the best possible like product? Why would I do that if I have a coach that sits 5 feet away from me that can do that job 100 times better? It's like, hey, Brian, can you come help me with this?
Right.
And can you show my team how to do this? Like, it's one thing to show me how to do it if like I really don't understand, or if I want to use it right away and I think this is going to be impactful right in the moment. I was like, can you show them? And then I'll learn at the same time. I'll learn how you actually teach the athletes rather than you teach a coach, because that's different too. Like, I can't imagine if you like some of the seminars or things that we've gone to, like for the conference, like CSCCA or Sornex, like Strong, or any of those things. If you were speaking to a different type of audience, if it's a coach teaching another coach, I want to see what a coach teaches an athlete. So bringing him out there to teach, or bringing our director out there, Caitlin, to teach and say, hey, can you show my athletes what it is? Because that's probably a dumbed down version that I need to know too. But
yeah, absolutely. And that's a great point. I'm programming for my wife she's competing as a powerlifter. She's 9 weeks out, and I've been writing all of her programs for about 3 years now. How I explain things to her is a lot different than how I talk to John or Terrence or Will. Like they have a higher base level knowledge of this that I can just, hey, this, that, and the other, done. My wife, she is a master's in occupational therapy. She still has a science background. So I don't have to dumb it down quite as much as I would to someone who's, say, a business major or an art major. But I still have to bring it down because she didn't go through all these internships and she doesn't know the same physiology as I do. So there's that intermediate of like, okay, I brought it down this far. Does that still make sense? Yes. Now can I bring it down to that next level? Or vice versa. I brought it down this far. How do I bring it up? So that's absolutely a great point. Of sometimes you're going to explain it differently to different audiences. That's a great point.
No, I like that. I think that's a way to do it, a good way to do it too. Like figuring out what the tone is and who your audience is. But I think even to what you said, maybe you didn't even realize it, was to actually ask if people comprehend that stuff too. Because I think that's one thing, especially when in a college setting, you're stuck with time always against you. So whatever you prioritize in a session, whatever's on the card or on the whiteboard or whatever is set up, anything that's that's bookending a training session with you, whatever you put in there is a priority. Whatever you don't get to is probably not. So choosing your words carefully, making sure that an athlete understands so you don't just waste the next hour. I think that's super beneficial. And as I've gotten farther in my career, that's one thing I've always tried to do is dumb down the program, make sure the athletes actually buy into what they're doing, understand why, because that's what's going to be a long-term payoff. If I just beat the shit out of them in an hour and they don't know why, they don't get a chance to recover, all these different things that kind of impact it, does that serve the day session, or does that serve the weeks, or does that serve them best for when they're a senior and they're going to be a captain on the team and they're actually going to be a higher role on the team as well? And I'd rather do that. As much as in the college profession, you're probably not going to be at a place for super long time. I want to say like the average for strength coaches at an organization is probably like 3 years, or so it seems. So yeah, a lot of times you're not going to see a freshman graduate. So is it really worth it? I still think it is, because it sets them up in the right position. But no, a great point's being able to talk to them and be able to actually speak in their language, because that's what's going to elevate the conversation and probably give you a lot more information and continue that conversation going forward.
Yeah, and that's actually another thing that I learned very quickly going from an intern to a full-time role was I explain the lift before every lift, right? I go through, if I've never done something, I'll explain, I'll go over it, and then I'll see what questions they have throughout the lift. And if I get a question more than twice, I'm going to turn the music off, be like, hey, I didn't explain this well enough. Let's go over this again. Cool, we've gone over it, see if it still comes up. And then at the end of every day, I go over a lot more in depth of, this is what we did today. This is part of why we did it. Do we have any questions? And sometimes today was the heavy work so that tomorrow can be light, and that way Thursday can be speed or whatever. Just a very, very basic general concept of like, this is what we're doing, this is why we're doing it. And the questions that I've gotten are either technical of like, hey, I didn't quite understand how to do this, or hey, that's really interesting. Why is that? Why are we doing it this way? Because I want to know the background. And I know that has helped a lot of them understand why we're doing what we're doing and how it's going to help them. And so I've seen a lot of good feedback from that, because then they go talk to their teammates and say, hey, this is going to really help us. We gotta work on this. And so just the questions you get and being able to communicate well. And then of course, like you said, making sure they understand. Every time I give an instruction, do we understand? If I'm talking to the team, it's, do we all understand? If I'm talking to you as an athlete, did that make sense to you? Yes or no? And I'm very clearly tell them all the time, if the answer is no, that's okay. Say no and let me explain it again. I'll find a way. I'll make sure you understand. And I think that's been very helpful for a lot of them, especially coming out of high school. A lot of times they're not given an answer. It's just, you're going to do this. And so having that explanation and being able to say, hey, I don't understand, I think is really helpful for a lot of them. And I think that goes a long way with getting more buy-in.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I think oftentimes, like we talked about with the timepiece, especially like NCAA rules in the collegiate setting, you're always working against the clock. And for strength coaches, depending on the sport too, you're not afforded a lot of opportunity and time to work with that team. So we feel like when they come in the weight room, that's our time and it's the most important thing. But there's already so many things on their mind that they're worried about, that oftentimes you probably don't get their best version of themselves, because lifting is more of sometimes not just a need. It's almost like a force of habit. Like, this is something that I have to do. Right. And it's not like that every single session, but it's easy to forget that as like strength coaches when maybe we don't see what's going on the rest of their lives. But I think the other thing that's really hard to remember too is, and maybe we forget about a lot of times, especially as we get older, and the type of athletes we're working with are still always going to be pretty much 18 to 22, is we forget what it's like to be a beginner. And that's the same thing with like having a conversation and kind of tailoring that conversation to have the tone and the language of who we're speaking to, like within that conversation. I think that goes the same when we're trying to teach and cue them on things, because we forget, like when we're talking, like we can make it in simplified terms and like say a bunch of like high level words and vocabulary, but for them, like that's going right over their head. And being able to make sure that it's fit to the type of athlete you're talking to or the training background, I think is important. And the other thing I thought about too, like when you talked about questioning them, and I'm going to steal that, like if I hear that same question twice, like I'm just going to stop the lift. Because if they already know if I hear how many reps, like I'll look right over their head and walk away. So
exactly.
If I'm getting the same question, I'm stopping lifts, because I think that's an important time to explain. And I was thinking about this too. If I'm thinking of it from a beginner standpoint, not all the questions are going to be answered in the beginning, like when you're going over a lift. And like, I think that those questions are going to happen because I have more of a knowledge base about how a program works, like what the flow of the lift's going to look like, why we're doing this exercise at this place. I know all those things. They don't. So somewhere like halfway in the lift or at the end of the lift, they're probably going to come up with more questions. And if your athletes are more comfortable to ask you those, like you might as well just direct them at everybody, so that now you start to build an understanding. Because that's my goal every year, to get to in season for whatever team it is and be able to like basically just give them the reins. It's like, I'll kind of steer you in the right direction. Off season's my bread and butter, and we're going to learn it. We're going to understand it. We're going to know why, and we're going to execute it. And then once we get in season, it's like, let's focus on your sport as much as possible. We'll touch on the things we need to, but you guys start taking ownership of this team. So no, I like that too. Like that, I think debriefing and briefing them on the beginning of lifts and answering those questions and talking them that way. I think those are great points, especially when you're first trying to get a hold of a team, or you're starting off with a new program.
Yeah, absolutely. You might have, when we were down there playing you guys at your home, you might have heard some of my guys just screaming for no reason, speed. No reason for them to be screaming speed, except that my focus for them in season was speed. And so at the end of at the beginning of every lift, I go over it and I yell, boys, what's our emphasis? And they just all yell speed. And so they just would get to games and they'd start yelling speed at each other, because that was our emphasis. And I don't remember what the point of the story was now.
No, I think that's great, because I mean, even if that's the only thing that they grasp onto, like they have a better understanding than someone else that goes up to the board and turns around and be like, what the hell did he just say?
Yeah. That was actually the point of giving them ownership. What is our emphasis? Speed. That is the only thing I care about. Move this weight fast. Now there's some other details in that, but this is what we're trying to do. I need you guys to understand that, and I need you to execute. That was the point of that story.
I love it. No, that's great. Hey, so like any good training session, we end the show with a good finisher. So we got 4 quarters, 4 questions, and we got overtime at the end. So you can go as quick as you want, or you could take your time on each question. But you ready?
I'm ready. Let's do it.
All right. First one I got for you: biggest influence in strength and conditioning, and favorite strength sport athlete of all time.
Louis Simmons and Dave Hoff. Louis Simmons by far is probably the most influential strength coach for me, just because of what I do and how I do it. Dave Hoff, I don't know if you know who this is. He was a West Side guy. He set the world record in total with 3,108 pounds, I believe. Absolute monster. I watched, it's called WPO, which is the IPF version of Worlds. I watched that last fall, and he tore his hamstring squatting. Tore it. Still squatted 1,100. Still deadlifted 800, and won the meet with a torn hamstring. Like, absolutely phenomenal. The dude is insane. You need to see him squat 1,300. Like, you have to see it. It's astronomical. It's not humanly possible, and yet he did it.
That's insane. Yep, I'm putting that on my list. I have not seen that one. I'm going to watch that later. Hey, so when you're not coaching or not training, what are some of your go-to hobbies outside the weight room walls?
So I'm a I'm a video game fan. I really like story-driven games, so I don't get on GTA Live and do anything like that. I just want to sit and be entertained. So I do that. I'm a huge like Marvel comic and movie fan. I'm just a huge nerd in general about that. And then I'm obsessed with my cat, Merlin. He's a cat, but he's like so dependent. He's basically a dog. And then I love going out and going to dates with my wife and exploring new restaurants and new places to go here around Greensboro. And I am actually a bourbon aficionado, so I spend way too much money on alcohol just because I want to try it and I want to make new drinks and things like that.
It's not bad hobbies. Hey, so I know you went through some changes like during your undergrad, but thinking about everything now, if you weren't coaching, what do you think you would be doing? And if you could go back and do it again, what sport would you have chosen if you could start back in high school?
Ooh, the sport question is going to be hard, I think. If I weren't doing this, I probably would be teaching elementary or middle school. Like I said earlier, I love kids. Coaching to me is a form of teaching. I love having that education factor. So I would most likely be teaching youngins. Sport, I always thought I would like boxing, but I'm pretty sure I'd be a huge pansy the first time I got punched in the face. My wife was a rower, and I love the concept of it. I don't know if I would have been good at it. But I think the final answer is going to be water polo. I loved water polo. I was garbage at it, but I loved water polo, and I would have gladly done that in college. I would have suffered through all the swimming that I hated so much just to be able to play that sport. If I could do it now, I would, but there's no, to my knowledge, any rec leagues around here, and I am way too out of shape to swim that far.
Man, water polo is like elegant outside the water, and inside the water is violent. It's awesome.
Buddy. The worst thing they did for that sport was put underwater cameras.
I think that's the best part. Hey, so if you're setting up an ideal training day, and this actually might change if you know anything about how High Point's weight room is set up, what would be your go-to training music and best post-training meal? Because I know you can't listen to it super loud.
So in an ideal world, I'm a huge fan of like some OG hip hop. Put on some NWA and just have a big day, boys. Post-training meal, again, in an ideal world, we're going to have some steak and a baked potato. Just something simple and easy, but delicious.
All right. Hey, so last one I got for you for overtime. In your opinion, what is the most important attribute of a successful coach?
The ability to adapt. You have to be able to adapt your leadership style depending on what team. You have to be able to adapt your communication style depending on what team. You have to be able to adapt to a change in schedule, to a change in the sport coach's whimsy. You have to be able to adapt to literally anything at any given moment. And if you can't, you will drown. So I think the most important attribute is adaptability.
I love it. That's awesome. No, that's a great point. I think that can play a role in any coaching at any different level. Adaptability is huge. Being able to learn on the fly, be able to kind of hand all the punches that are put your way. Like, unless you're training a barbell sport with barbells, like, you're going to be the second fiddle to a sport coach. So
correct.
No, great advice. Hey, so for anybody that's got any questions, any follow-up, any advice, any stuff that they want to kind of throw your way, how can they get a hold of you or follow up after this conversation?
Absolutely. If they want to shoot me an email, that is Wentz at highpoint.edu. Or you can find me on Instagram. It's Wentzstrong, WENTZSTRONG.
Awesome. Hey, well, Andrew, I can't thank you enough. It was good to finally get a hold of you and come down to High Point and see what you guys got going on. And I can't thank you enough for coming on the show today and sharing with the audience, man.
No, thank you. It's been a pleasure. This is not something I normally get to do, so only going to make me better by being uncomfortable.
Well, I appreciate it, man. I hope this was easy going and you get more comfortable with it as we go on.
I'm sure it will. Thank you.
Awesome, man. Take care.
You too.
That's it for this episode of The Strength Game. Thank you again to this week's guest and to our sponsors. Be sure to connect and keep up with our guests at the links in the description below. Remember to subscribe to us on Apple and Google Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast provider to stay up to date on all future episodes. Also, check us out on YouTube and CoachO'Brien.com, where you can find all the video versions of these episodes, as well as show notes, episode schedule, and much more. Comments, ratings, and reviews are always welcome and appreciated. Thanks again for tuning in, and be sure to join us next week for another great episode of The Strength Game.